Last time we spoke about the battles of Peleliu and Angar. Following the amphibious assaults in Peleliu and Angar, U.S. Marines under General Rupertus intensified their offensive. On September the 17th, Colonel Hannikin's 7th Marines advanced in Peleliu's southern sector as the 1st and 5th Marines pushed north, confronting the fortified Umbrogo Mountains, where Colonel Nakagawa's defenses stalled their progress. Despite reaching key positions by mid-morning, intense Japanese counterattacks continued, causing heavy casualties. On September the 18th, the 7th Marines, aided by armor, resumed their slow advance, securing the southern part of Peleliu by the day's end. Meanwhile, the 1st and 5th Marines faced brutal combat in the central ridges, suffering significant losses. By September the 21st, the capture of the nearby Ulithi Atoll provided a strategic base for future operations. Despite securing important positions, the Marines encountered severe resistance in the Umbrogo Mountains, leading to high casualties and necessitating reinforcements. By September the 23rd, the Americans secured the footholds on Peleliu and Angar, yet fierce fighting persisted in Nakagawa's fortified positions. This episode is the Japanese triumph in China. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, the Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over there, I just released a new episode on underrated moments of World War II. Also, if you'd like to personally support me, you can check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. A poll recently just closed, and the next episode on the Patreon is going to be about a alternate history. What if Japan invaded the USSR? So if that's of interest to you, go check it out. This week we are picking right back up over on Peleliu and Angar, where the Japanese are still providing stiff resistance. On September the 23rd, Colonel Venable's 322nd Regiment had made little progress breaking into the Lake Salam Bowl. With their commanding officer severely injured, a change in tactics was imminent. On the morning of the 24th, propaganda broadcast over a public address system was used to try and persuade the remaining Japanese to surrender. However, only 2 Japanese soldiers surrendered, reporting that over 300 defenders remained in the bowl under Major Goto. This accurate estimate was disregarded by the American command, who believed about only 150 defenders remained. Following this failed attempt, all available artillery bombarded the bowl in preparation for an attack from the north, altering the appearance of the bowl's interior and rims to add to the upcoming assault. Back at Peleliu, after a heavy bombardment, Colonel Dark's 321st Regiment resumed their advance north along the coast on the 24th, despite continued harassment from Japanese fire from the central ridges. By noon, they had secured the trail road junction south of Garkoru. Some troops explored the trail to the east, encountering heavy resistance, while Company G advanced rapidly north through Garkoru, reaching the 04 line. Behind them, Dark's 3rd Battalion and Colonel Hannikin's 3rd Battalion also pushed northwards. Further east, the 7th Marines pressed against Colonel Nakagawa's main defenses on the Umbrogo Mountains. By nightfall, having successfully resisted Japanese counterattacks on the 04 line, General Rupertus' northward drive had proven to be a significant success. Rupertus next planned to cut across the island on the 25th through the eastern trail to completely isolate the Japanese forces in the Umbrogo ridges. At 7 a.m., Dark's troops began moving eastwards, with E Company successfully reaching the edge of the East Road against light opposition. They halted in front of Hill B, which dominated the eastern area. However, the 3rd Battalion encountered heavier resistance from pillboxes and emplacements, protected by steep walls and sheer cliffs, guarding the northern approaches to the Umbrogo defense system, making little progress. Meanwhile, to the north, a strong tank infantry patrol advanced about 1,200 yards, killing some 30 Japanese and destroying 4 pillboxes and 2 large supply dumps before reaching the 05 line. The weak resistance encountered by the patrol suggested that the remaining Japanese strength was concentrated in the Umabrogo pocket. Thus, at 10:30, reporters decided to commit the 5th Marines for a drive to the northern tip of Peleliu, rapidly relieved by the 1st Marines on eastern Peleliu. Orders to move to the western portion of Peleliu found the 5th Marines in a static position on the eastern parts of Peleliu, where the regimental mission had been to prevent enemy counter-landings. The 1st Battalion was deployed in the vicinity of a radio direction finding station near Ngardolok. The 2nd Battalion was holding the islands north of the northeastern peninsula, while the 3rd Battalion, less than 1 company, occupied defensive positions along Purple Beach. The 1st Marines completed the relief of the 5th shortly after noon and assumed command of the 5th Marine sector at that time. In order to expedite movement of the regiment to the West Road, the battalions moved out on trucks at 1 o'clock, with the 1st Battalion 5th Marines in the lead, followed by the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines and the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines. By 4 p.m., the 5th Marines had executed the passage of the lines, and the regiment passed through phase line 04 near Garkoru. As the 1st Battalion continued its advance up the West Road, it encountered erratic resistance from what appeared to be Japanese holdouts. The level terrain was devoid of the dense jungle growth abounding everywhere on Peleliu and offered ideal conditions for the movement of tanks and LVT flamethrowers accompanying the advanced battalion. Aside from the occasional Japanese sniper and motor fire, the advance continued for about 500 yards without interruption to Road Junction 15, where the west and east roads met. This vital point was defended by a small Japanese force which had installed itself on a ridge dominating the road forks. Around 5 p.m., as the Marines approached this point, the enemy opened fire which served only to delay the Marines. When the firefight ended, the Japanese had lost 20 killed. The battalion continued its advance for another 100 yards and seized the Japanese radio station, whose towers the forward elements of the RCT 321st had spotted on the previous day. Having secured this objective, the battalion established night defenses north of the radio station, from the beach to the high ground east of the West Road. Upon reaching Road Junction 15 in the wake of the advance of the 1st Battalion, the 3rd Battalion pivoted to the southeast and headed down East Road, where it established night defenses on the road and along the western slopes of Hill 80. That later hill, in itself, was an isolated terrain feature, and it owed its importance to its location, for it was the only link separating the Himalayan Lull ridges to the south from the Amangal ridges, which form the northmost hill mass on Peleliu. Throughout the evening and the night, the forward elements at the radio station were continuously and heavily attacked and bombed, but managed to hold out against an enemy onslaught. Meanwhile, at Angar, after a heavy and prolonged artillery bombardment, the 3rd Battalion, 322nd Regiment pushed forward to launch its assault from the north. Finding no south route over the cliffs, they assembled near the northern end of the Milwaukee Railroad for an attack west the following day. At 7:30 a.m. on September the 26th, the infantry launched their assault on Lake Salom, quickly taking control of the eastern rim with minimal resistance. Facing increasing enemy fire, the Americans made their way down the eastern rim to the bowl floor. However, by the end of the day, they were halted by Goto's positions on the northern cliffs and the island, a gap between an overgrown coral mound and the eastern rim. To the south, the 2nd Battalion supported the attack by advancing north, capturing the southeast rim, and clearing out several enemy cave positions. Back over on Peleliu, the Marines had a very rough night, full of Japanese infiltration harassment. In fact, our old friend Eugene Sledge wrote about the night of September the 25th and what his K-Unit 3rd Battalion 5th Marines went through. The Japanese who had come across the road in front of me were probably members of what the enemy called a close-quarter combat unit. The enemy soldiers shot by Sam was not dressed or equipped like their typical infantrymen. Rather, he wore only tropical khaki shorts, short-sleeved shirt, and tabby footwear, those split-toed rubber-soled canvas shoes. He carried only his bayonet. When he entered our line, where he did may have been by pure accident, or he may have had an eye on our motor. His comrade angled off towards the right near a machine gun on our flank. Mortars machine guns were favorite targets for infiltrators on the front lines. To the rear they went after our heavy mortars, communications and artillery. Before Company K moved out, I went down the road to the next company to see what had happened during the night. I learned that those blood-chilling screams had come from the Japanese I had seen run that very night. He had jumped into a foxhole where he met an alert Marine. In the ensuing struggle, each had lost his weapon. The desperate Marine had jammed his forefinger into the enemy's eye socket and killed him. Such was the physical horror and brutish reality of war for us. The 1st Battalion 5th Marines spent the early hours of the 26th consolidating their positions around the radio station and preparing for a continuation of their attack later that day in the northern tip of Peleliu. Shortly after 6 a.m., the 3rd Battalion jumped off for an attack against Hill 80 with Company K on the left and Company I on the right. The attack carried the hill, and by 8:30 the assault force reached a swamp bordering the eastern coast of Peleliu. This advance of the 3rd Battalion was of major importance because it effectively cut the island in two. Late in the afternoon, most of the battalion moved back to Hill 80 to reserve positions near the junction of East and West Roads. The unit's southern flank extended south from the junction along East Road to Hill 80, where Company I was stationed for the night. Between Company I, the 5th Marines, and the 2nd Battalion 321st Infantry at Hill B lay a gap approximately 1,800 yards through which only the 321st Infantry Neal Task Force had been placed. In this gap lay a 1,500-yard-long Camelanal Mountain, held by an unknown number of Japanese, not yet explored by the American units. The 5th Marines consolidated their positions and resumed their assault. The 1st Battalion 5th Marines ran into some stiff opposition from the Amagal Ridges dominating northern Peleliu. The northern portion of the L-shaped hill system consisted of ridges running generally from northeast to southwest for about 1,000 yards. The southern leg extended from the northwest to the southeast. The southern leg of the ridges was not continuous, but broken into 4 separate hills or knobs, designated from northwest to southeast as Hill 1, 2, 3, and Radar Hill, so named because it was at one time serving as an enemy radar installation. These 4 knobs were to gain ill repute as Hill Row. The entire Amagal Ridge system was held in strength by the Japanese, particularly the portion paralleling the route of advance of the 1st Battalion 5th Marines. This part contained some of the most elaborate caves and tunnels on Peleliu. The battalion had barely started out along the western road when the enemy in and around Hill 1 opened up on the Marines with 37mm and 75mm guns as well as automatic weapons and mortars. This curtain of fire from the Amagal Ridges was reinforced by heavy fire from the Yetsubus Island. All forward movement soon halted. Attacking eastwards from the west road, Company B assaulted the second knob Hill 2, but also encountered opposition. Through sheer determination, the company was able to gain a firm foothold on the hill by early afternoon. This accomplishment, in effect, served to outflank the Japanese on Hill 1, but Japanese resistance on the last mentioned hill continued throughout the day. An attempt by Company C to seize all of Hill 1 during the remaining hours of daylight was unsuccessful, and continuation of the assault had to await the following day. During the bitter fighting in which the 1st Battalion engaged during the night of the 25th, and for the most part of the following day, the 2nd Battalion remained stationary on the southern flank of the regiment. At 4 p.m. on the 26th, when it became apparent that the 1st Battalion could make no further progress, the 2nd Battalion was ordered to attack. The battalion advanced northwards through the left wing of the 1st Battalion, carefully bypassing the embattled Hill 1. In the course of its advance, the battalion drew heavy fire from the Japanese emplacements in the plain, from the ridges on the right, as well as from Negabus Island. Enemy mortars proved especially troublesome. As a result of the heavy fire, Company F lost 4 of its supporting tanks before it advanced very far beyond Hill 1. Attempts by artillery to give all possible support to the battalion were largely ineffective. As noted by an eyewitness, "We fired frequent missions throughout the day of these mortars. The reported effect was that the mortars were neutralized while we fired, but they were not destroyed. The enemy apparently withdrew into the caves during the period of our fire." As evening approached, the 5th Marines occupied a jagged front line. The 1st Battalion, though out of contact with the 2nd, was tied with the 3rd on its right. The mission of the 3rd Battalion was to support either the 1st or the 2nd Battalions in the event of a major Japanese counterattack. Further progress of the 2nd Battalion was impeded by a large anti-tank ditch, which blocked the approach to the remnants of the Peleliu phosphate plant. The Japanese had converted the reinforced concrete foundation of the otherwise demolished structure into a major defensive installation. Exposed to the enemy fire from Negabus Island and the plunging fire from caves and defensive positions from the hills, the 2nd Battalion found itself in a very enviable situation. Further south, after some necessary adjustments, Dark's forces assaulted Hill B with 2 battalions. Initially repelled, Dark then sent a task force led by Captain George Neal to attack from the north. After a complex maneuver north then to the south, the Neil Task Force attacked Hill B, just as other elements of the 321st fought their way over the top through the challenging terrain. The hill eventually fell to the Americans, completing the isolation of the Amabrokel Pocket. By the end of the day, the island was divided into two places, leaving Nakagawa's determined defenders isolated in the two major pockets. On the 27th, with the Amabrokel Pocket now contained, the 5th Marines continued their operations against the Amagawa Mountain. At the same time, the 1st Battalion, 321st Regiment advanced north from Hill B to close in the long gap along the eastern road up to Hill 80. Dark's infantrymen secured the Kamalolo Mountain with minimal resistance and then moved towards the Marines' Road Junction. The 2nd Battalion was to find progress extremely rough for the remainder of the day. First, the phosphate plant, which the Japanese had turned into a blockhouse, had to be secured in an area that bristled with snipers. The problem confronting Colonel Harris was a formidable one. The blockhouse in front of the 2nd Battalion could only be taken after the anti-tank ditch, blocking its approaches, had been seized. This was a job that the infantry could not tackle without armored support. The regimental commander decided to utilize all arms available in reducing the obstacles. First off, Colonel Harris called naval gunfire and artillery against Nigabus Island and on other targets suspected to be harboring artillery and motor positions. A medium tank equipped with a bulldozer blade was pressed into service to level the anti-tank ditch and fill it by 8:30 a.m. An LVT flamethrower then was able to come in within effective range of the Japanese fortification. Moments later, when the flame and smoke had cleared, all resistance from the stronghold had ceased and more than 60 dead Japanese remained in the rubble. While this action was in progress, patrols from Company E seized a small, weakly defended ridge abutting the road from the east. The 2nd Battalion thereafter resumed its advance northwards along the road, as well over an adjacent ridge. Company F, at the head of the column, soon found itself embroiled in some of the most bitter and frustrating action of the entire campaign. Aside from receiving heavy Japanese artillery and mortar fire, the company faced a series of pillboxes and field fortifications on level ground, and layer upon layer of caves in the hillsides. Even though they were not aware of it all at the time, the men of the 5th Marines had come up to the most skillfully constructed defenses on Peleliu. The Japanese army had utilized all of its many natural caves possessing tactical value, adapting them for the emplacement of heavier weapons with great ingenuity. On the other hand, the Japanese naval troops had preferred to construct their own caves with the help of the 214th Naval Construction Battalion, composed of men who had been professional miners and tunnel workers in civilian life. Since most of these Navy caves were located near the northern end of Peleliu, they proved a serious obstacle to the advance of the 5th Marines. Again, our friend Eugene Sledge faced these obstacles firsthand, and he saw the effectiveness of flamethrowers. Here is a passage from him. Bergen's order to us to continue firing into the opening interrupted by musings. We kept up a steady fire into the pillbox to keep the Japanese pinned down while the flamethrowers came up, carried by Corporal Womack from Mississippi. He was a brave, good-natured guy, and popular with the troops, but he was one of the fiercest-looking Marines I'd ever seen. He was big and husky, with a fierce red beard well powdered with white coral dust. He reminded me of some wild Viking. I was glad we were on the same side. Stooped under the heavy tanks on his back, Womack approached the pillbox with his assistant just out of the line of our fire. When he got about 15 yards from the target, he ceased firing. The assistant reached up and turned a valve on the flamethrower. Womack then aimed the nozzle at the opening made by the 75mm gun. He pressed the trigger with a whoosh. The flame leaped out at the opening. Some muffled screams, then all went quiet. Even the stoic Japanese couldn't suppress the agony of death by fire and suffocation. But they were no more likely to surrender to us than we would have been to them had we been confronted with the possibility of surrender. In fighting the Japanese, surrender was not one of our options. Sheer courage and heroism in themselves proved inadequate for the task. In the course of the morning of the 27th, Company F seized the two ridges forming the northwestern anchor of the Amangao system and established observation posts on its crests. But this did not solve the problem of what to do about the Japanese occupying the caves about halfway up the hill. Marine casualties mounted steadily, and evacuation of the wounded became more and more difficult. Since the cave openings completely dominated the road leading past the northmost ridge of Peleliu, the advance of the entire 2nd Battalion ground to a halt. The first tank attempting to squeeze through the narrow gap between the hill and the northwestern shore was hit. The Marines occupying the crest of the hill were powerless to cope with the caves underneath. Although the Americans now controlled the northern shore and blocked further enemy reinforcements, skilled Japanese miners continued their resistance underground. What the Marines did not know was that they were facing the most comprehensive cave system on Peleliu, which was the underground home of the Japanese naval construction units, who were, luckily for the Marines, better miners than infantrymen. The Japanese army had utilized all of the many natural caves possessing tactical value, adapting them for emplacement of heavier weapons with great ingenuity. On the other hand, Japanese naval troops had preferred to construct their own caves with the help of the 214th Naval Construction Battalion, composed of men who had been professional miners and tunnel workers in civilian life. Since most of these naval caves were located near the northern end of Peleliu, they proved a serious obstacle to the advance of the 5th Marines. In the end, it would take weeks for the Marines to finally quash all the resistance at the Akarokoro Point. Then only by blasting closed in all the tunnel entrances sealed the Japanese defenders inside to their fate. To the south, Harrison's 1st Battalion pressed on with their attack on the mountain's southern leg, successfully capturing Hill 1. Meanwhile, the 322nd Regiment resumed their assault against the Lake Salom Bowl, fighting to secure the base of the North Rim but encountering less resistance to the south as most Japanese defenders had been evacuated towards Ramondo. The following day, despite a successful enemy mortar barrage that initially forced a temporary withdrawal and reorganization, the Americans cleared the entire bowl floor of Japanese troops, isolating Goto's remaining forces in the Ramondo area. This progress enabled the 322nd to launch a final coordinated attack on October the 1st, with its 3 battalions trapping the enemy in the Ramondo pocket, although they were unable to penetrate Goto's final defenses. On the 28th at Peleliu, while Dark's 1st Battalion engaged Japanese infiltrators while mopping up at the Kamalalo Mountain area, Harris's 1st and 2nd Battalions continued their assault against the Amagal and successfully captured Hill 3. This action isolated the remaining Japanese forces at Radar Hill. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, executed a successful landing on the Nigabus Island, with minimal resistance after a comprehensive artillery air-naval bombardment. The curtain of the drama on Nigabus Island opened on the morning of September the 28th when the massed fire of 5 artillery battalions from Peleliu, as well as heavy fire from warships and aircraft, blanketed the island. Near the northwestern shore of Peleliu, an impressive gathering of high-ranking officers had assembled to witness the operation. The group included such notables as Admiral Fort, Generals Julian Smith, Geiger, Rupertus, Mueller, Oliver P. Smith, and Bell. The weather was cool and cloudy, and interspersed with frequent rain squalls. For the Corsair pilots of VMF 114, air support for Nigabus Island landings represented a very interesting and original assignment. The operation marked the beginning of combat work for the squadron, which had reached Peleliu only 2 days earlier. At 6:30 a.m., the Corsairs hit the airstrip on Nigabus Island with 500-pound bombs and strafed the entire island as well as Kongaru to the northeast. In the words of some of the pilots, strafing runs were made just a few feet off the deck, and a hail of lead laid over the island. At 8:40 a.m., 20 Corsairs preceded the landing craft and gave the island another heavy strafing. In the course of the attack, Japanese mortar positions were spotted, and one especially prominent square blockhouse with an iron door was fired on and neutralized. Whenever aircraft were not directly over the island, the artillery on Peleliu and naval guns offshore gave Nigabus Island a heavy going over, starting at 7 a.m. and concluding at 9:05 a.m. Both quick and delay fuses were used. Observers reported that the island was completely covered with fire. In the course of the preliminary bombardment, naval gunfire ships pounded the northern portion of Nigabus Island and continued to fire on the part of the island throughout the landing. The Marines advanced inland, swiftly securing the airstrip and the eastern portion of Nigabus. One platoon then landed on Kongaru and the Murphy Islands to secure them against light opposition. However, the attack to the northwest encountered strong resistance from the Japanese forces entrenched in caves and dugouts, prompting the deployment of tanks to support the Marine assault. By 5 p.m., nearly all of Nigabus was under American control, with only a few hundred yards at the extremity on the northwestern tip remaining in Japanese hands, and some caves on the ridges still needing to be cleared. The 3rd Battalion had spent a relatively quiet night on Nigabus Island. On the morning of the 29th, Companies I and K resumed their attack. Progress was normal until the 2 companies had reached the northern tip of Nigabus when a 75mm gun opened up at point-blank range. The Marines quickly destroyed this weapon and went on to overcome the rest of the resistance on the island. At about 3 o'clock on the 29th, Nigabus was declared secure. An hour later, the 2nd Battalion of the 321st Regiment relieved the Marines and completed mopping up. Having accomplished the mission on the island, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines returned to Peleliu. The battalion had secured the island at the cost of 15 killed and 33 wounded. In return, the Marines killed or captured 470 Japanese. Infantrymen of the 2nd Battalion, 321st Regiment were to account for another 100 of the enemy during the ensuing mop-up operations. Our friend Eugene Sledge wrote this about the final capture of Nigabus. The next morning, again with the help of tanks and Amtraks, our battalion took most of the remainder of Nigabus. Our casualties were remarkably low for the number of Japanese we killed. In mid-afternoon, we learned that an army unit would relieve us shortly and complete the job on the northern end of Nigabus. Our motor section halted to await orders and dispersed amongst some of the bushes. In our midst was the wreckage of a Japanese heavy machine gun and the remains of a squad that had been wiped out by Company K. The squad members had been killed in the exact positions to be occupied by such a squad, according to the book. At first glance, the dead gunner appeared about to fire his deadly weapon. He still sat bolt upright, in the proper firing position behind his breech of his machine gun. Even in his death, his eyes stared widely along the gun sights. Despite the vacant look of his dilated pupils, I couldn't believe he was dead. Cold chills ran along my spine. Gooseflesh tickled my back. It seemed as though he was looking through me into all eternity, that at any instant he would raise his hands, which rested in a relaxed manner on his thighs, gripping the handles on his breech, trying to press the thumb trigger. The bright, shiny brass slugs in the strip clip appeared as ready as the gunner, anxious to speed out, to kill, and to maim more of the American devils. But he would rot, and they would corrode. Neither he or his ammo could do anything more for the Emperor. The rest of the 5th Marines continued their operations on the 29th, launching a full-scale assault of Radar Hill using flamethrowers, bazookas, and demolition charges, finally capturing the position by the morning of the 30th. Following the completion of operations in northern Peleliu, the 5th Marines were relieved by the 321st Regiment. However, as the army troops took over, the remaining Japanese who had been hiding underground reoccupied some positions, requiring 2 additional days of fighting to fully secure northern Peleliu. Nonetheless, the Japanese presence in Peleliu had now been reduced to Nakagawa's Amaburo pocket, so Peleliu was officially secured. Total losses during the battle so far included 843 killed, 3,845 wounded, and 356 missing for the 1st Marine Division. 46 killed, 226 wounded, and 7 missing from the 321st Regiment, and an estimated 9,076 Japanese dead, plus 180 prisoners of war. Yet that is all for today with Peleliu and Angar, as we now need to travel over to China, where the Japanese are still carrying out Operation Ichigo in an effort to capture Guilin and Luizhou. As we last observed, General Yokoyama's 11th Army had taken control of Lingling's airdrome and Chuanzhou by September the 14th. Following this, they reorganized their units in preparation for resuming their offensive in October. Meanwhile, the 34th Division was deploying towards Changning, and the 37th Division moved to capture Shaoyang, which fell by the end of the month. The 23rd Army also made final preparations for their offensive in early September. General Tanaka directed the Kawakami raiding unit in a wide flanking maneuver along the Jukong-Huoji Road towards Wuzhou, while the 23rd Independent Mixed Brigade embarked on a long march towards Guiping. On September the 13th, the 22nd Independent Mixed Brigade and the 22nd and 104th Divisions began their main advance towards Wuzhou. However, the Kawakami raiding unit successfully captured Wuzhou on the 22nd and seized the Danjujian airfield 6 days later. Each unit then continued its advance westwards to Guiping, which fell to the 23rd Brigade on October the 11th. So far, Tanaka's forces had encountered very little resistance, but this was about to change. After the war, in discussing the performance of the Chinese divisions supposed to defend Guilin and Luizhou, the political situation in East China and the attitudes of the East China commanders, such as Marshal Hatta, remarked that in his opinion, Li Zongren and Bai Chongxi had kept their forces out of serious fighting in order to conserve them for the future. At the time, there were rumors that these men were planning a coup against Chiang Kai-shek. Chinese resistance was light, but with its supply situation improved, the 14th Air Force again did its best on the Salween, as well as in East China. In September alone, the force dropped 1,897 tons of bombs and fired 1,280,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, some of the later, of course, at aerial targets. In early September, Japanese fighter reinforcements from the homeland had also entered the combat. The Japanese were pleased at the performance of their late-model fighters with one of their air regiments they sent to China. Thanks to the air cover thus supplied, for the first time in the East China campaign, they found themselves able to move supplies regularly on the Jiangjiang, which paralleled their line of advance and so thought their prospects were brightened. At the beginning of the month, Yokoyama renewed his offensive, with the 58th Division successfully taking Jing'an and the 34th Division capturing Jiangning. The 37th Division was then deployed to Dao, and the 34th Division was sent to Jing'an in preparation for a final push towards Guilin. On October the 20th, this attack commenced as Yokoyama directed the 216th Regiment to advance to Leutun, the 58th Division to assault the area north of Guilin, the 40th Division to move to Gaoshangjian, the 13th Division to advance to Zhuanhuitun, and the 3rd Division to push towards Fuchuan. With minimal resistance from the retreating Japanese forces, most of these movements were completed by the end of the month. The 3rd Division pushed towards Pingle, while the 37th Division occupied Gongchongjiang and Yanshan to approach Guilin from the south. On November the 3rd, the 3rd Division captured Luipu and began preparations for the advance towards Luijian, encircling Guilin and opening the route to Luijin. Meanwhile, on October the 22nd, Tanaka ordered the reinforced 23rd Brigade to continue its advance towards Guigang, with the 104th and 22nd Divisions pushing towards Wushuan. Their progress, previously unopposed, was now challenged by the Chinese 46th and 64th Armies, which launched daily attacks against Guiping with substantial air support. As a result, the 22nd Division was redirected to counter the Chinese forces, successfully forcing their withdrawal by October the 29th. Following this victory, the 23rd Brigade captured Guigang on November the 3rd, and the 104th Division seized Wushan the following day. This allowed Tanaka's forces to begin a northern pursuit to support Yokoyama's assaults on Guilin and Luijian. After the 3rd Anshan strike, General LeMay began implementing reforms with the 20th Bomber Command. These changes included reorganizing the command, enhancing the logistical systems, adjusting target priorities, and improving coordination with Pacific operations. As a result, the frequency of missions increased each month, with each mission becoming more substantial and effective. Concurrently following the successful completion of the newly renamed Isley Field on Saipan, the 73rd Bombardment Wing was redirected to the Marianas instead of the CBI Theater. There it would join Major General Haywood Hansel's 21st Bomber Command, tasked with executing high-altitude, daylight precision attacks to cripple Japan's aircraft industry. The 21st Bomber Command arrived on Saipan on October the 12th of 1944, and from the start, General Hansel was beset by a host of serious command problems, the worst of which continued teething problems with the B-29, tardy delivery of aircraft, air crews untrained in high-altitude formation flying, primitive airfield conditions, lack of air service command for logistical support, no repair depots, a total absence of target intelligence, stubborn internal resistance to daylight operations by his sole combat wing, subordinates in the 21st Bomber Command who lobbied for his removal, and Hansel's inferiority in rank in dealing with other AAF commanders in the area. Furthermore, Hansel was soon prohibited from flying combat missions with his command, possibly because of limited knowledge of the atomic bomb or the perception that he knew of the existence of Ultra. As plans for sustained bomber offensives against Honshu progressed, the strategic focus of Operation Matterhorn diminished. The 20th Bomber Command shifted its flying missions in direct support of other Pacific operations, with target priorities moving from coke ovens to the aircraft industry. In preparations for the upcoming invasion of the Philippines, the command was tasked with 2 closely spaced maximum missions against Okayama in Formosa, totaling 170 sorties along with very long-range reconnaissance missions. Yet now we have to travel over to the India-Burma theater for a moment. As the advance towards the Chinwind continued, the resilient 33rd Division finally crossed the river in late November. General Katamura was finalizing his plans for a withdrawal to the Mandalay sector, scheduled for December. This decision was driven by the intense pressure the British 36th Division was putting on General Takeda's defensive positions at Pinhui, forcing the defenders to progress for a final retreat by the end of November. Meanwhile, General Slim was preparing for Operation Capital. He planned to stretch air power to its limits to move 4 2/3 divisions across the Chinwind, along with 2 tank brigades. After establishing bridgeheads at Sitang, Malake, and Kalawa, he intended to cross the Chinwind and confront General Kimura's forces between the Chinwind and the Irrawaddy. The 4th Corps, now under the experienced General Meservey, would break out from the Sitang bridgehead, advance east through the mountains, and capture Pinlubu, and then approach the Shwibo Plain for the north. Simultaneously, General Stauffer's 33rd Corps would move from Kalawa, following the Chinwind southeast to Ye and Manua. Once the Japanese forces were pushed out onto the open plain, Slim planned to exploit his overwhelming advantage in air power and tanks to decisively defeat them, anticipating the enemy would fiercely defend Mandalay. The combination of the defeats at Kohima and Impal, Mogang, and Mitkinya meant that by autumn of 1944, Kimura's role was reduced to defending southern Burma as the northern flank of their new Southeast Asia defense zone. With few reinforcements or supplies to look forward to, Kimura had grim prospects. On paper, he had about 10 divisions, though this was really 7, since little remained of the 3 divisions that had been devastated at Kohima and Impal. He also had the dubious support of Bose's INA and Aung San's 7th Battalion Burma National Army, but the civilian population was increasingly going over to the side of the likely winners. Unexpectedly, Kimura received 30,000 fresh troops in the period of June-October, but he was still rapidly running out of supplies. Even though he had 45,000 tons of food, 500 lorries, and 2,000 pack animals, it was very difficult to get them to the front. Kimura was painfully aware that the situation could only get worse. The Southeast Asia zone was slowly being throttled by Allied naval blockades. All the approaches to Rangoon were mined, and in 1944, total Japanese shipping losses amounted to 2.3 million tons. Even though ships that ran the blockade would proceed no further than Penang in Malaya. Kimura chose to deploy smaller units to delay the British Indian forces while the main body of the 15th Army retreated across the Irrawaddy River. His strategy was to launch a counterattack once the British crossed the river, aiming to replicate a reverse Impal by wearing down the British Indian forces through attrition and then destroying them during their retreat in May of 1945, that being the monsoon season. Meanwhile, Admiral Mountbatten was also seeking a victory of his own. On November the 8th, he ordered an assault on Japanese positions in the Arakan, with a deadline set for the end of January. This operation would be assigned to General Christensen's 15th Corps. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over there I'm releasing part 5 of my new series about the North African campaign during World War II. Also, if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. This month's exclusive podcast is going to be an alternate history. What if Japan attacked the USSR during Operation Barbarossa? The fighting on Peleliu and Angar raged as American forces struggled against resilient Japanese defenders. Significant advances were made, including the isolation of the Umbrogo Pocket and the capture of Negabus Island. Despite heavy casualties, Peleliu was eventually secured, leaving a small pocket of Japanese resistance.